There is a particular kind of silence that fills a room when a man finally speaks the truth about someone he has lost. Not the silence of grief, though that is part of it, but the silence of recognition, of understanding what he had and what he failed to recognize in the moment. Paul McCartney has spent more than 2 decades living in that silence, watching the world celebrate his legacy while carrying the weight of what he did not say to George Harrison while George was still alive to hear it. And now, in his later years, Paul has begun to break that silence, piece by piece, story by story, trying to reconstruct a relationship that was built on music and brotherhood, but fractured under the weight of ego, ambition, and the very success that should have held them together. The story begins in 1954 in Liverpool, on long bus rides where 2 young boys discovered that they shared something far more powerful than school could ever provide. Paul McCartney was a year ahead of George Harrison, already developing a reputation for being bright, witty, and naturally musical. His father had been a jazz band leader in the 1920s. Music was in his blood. George, on the other hand, was quieter. He was younger. He was still searching for who he was supposed to become. He had admitted years later that the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys was the worst time of his life. The rigid structure felt suffocating. The class divisions felt wrong. But on the bus rides into town, away from school uniforms and authority, something different happened. George saw Paul carrying a guitar. They started talking about music. They talked about Elvis Presley and Little Richard and Buddy Holly. They talked about the skiffle craze that was sweeping Britain, a raw, homemade music that made young people believe they could form bands of their own without waiting for permission from the establishment. George was captivated by the raw energy of that sound. He went home and began sketching guitars in his school notebooks. He practiced simple chords until his fingertips bled. Paul, who had already been playing guitar for years, recognized something in George. He recognized dedication. He recognized hunger. And despite their age difference, music erased that gap between them. By 1957, when Paul joined John Lennon's band The Quarrymen, he immediately thought of George. John was skeptical. George was too young, too babyface, too inexperienced. But one evening, on the top deck of a Liverpool bus, George auditioned for John by playing a note-perfect version of a rockabilly instrumental called Ranchy. Lennon could not argue with that. George was in, and with that, the nucleus of the Beatles was complete. For Paul, who had lost his mother to cancer at 14, the friendship with George and John offered something he desperately needed: companionship, purpose, a reason to believe that his life had direction. For George, it was validation. It was proof that he belonged among older, more experienced players. This period cemented Paul's role as George's mentor and champion. But it also set the stage for a relationship that, while rooted in genuine brotherhood, would eventually struggle under the weight of ambition, ego, and fame on a scale that no one could have predicted. As the Beatles rose from Liverpool clubs to dominating the entire world in the early 1960s, something fundamental shifted in the relationship between Paul and George. By 1966, they were no longer just 4 young men experimenting with music. They were the most famous people on the planet, and fame changes things. Paul began to step naturally into the role of the band's driving creative force. He thrived in the studio. He pushed for innovation. He orchestrated arrangements with precision. He demanded perfection. For George, watching his older friend and mentor take complete control was suffocating. It felt like the younger brother was being systematically erased. The making of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967 made this tension impossible to ignore. The album was almost entirely Paul's vision, a revolutionary record that would redefine rock music. But for George, it highlighted how little space was left for his ideas. His one contribution, Within You Without You, reflected his deep immersion in Indian philosophy and spiritual music. But to Paul, it was just another track in a concept album. To George, it was deeply personal. It was an expression of who he was becoming as a human being, not just as a musician. During the Beatles' trip to India in 1968, the philosophical gulf between them became even clearer. George saw meditation and spirituality as genuinely life-changing. He was searching for meaning beyond material success. Paul treated it more casually, more as an interesting diversion. At one point, Paul joked with George, saying something like, "Calm down, Georgie boy, we need a sense of humor here." But to George, it was not a laughing matter. The Beatles' obsession with records and business, with being the biggest, the loudest, the most successful, was distracting him from what he believed was essential. It was distracting him from becoming who he was meant to be. As the decade moved toward its end, Paul grew increasingly determined to control the direction of the Beatles. And George, who had quietly been writing extraordinary songs, became increasingly frustrated at being treated as a sidekick rather than an equal. For years, his compositions had been seen as secondary to the Lennon-McCartney catalogue, but George was no longer content with that arrangement. And Paul's inability or unwillingness to recognize George's growth would come at a profound cost. By 1969, the Beatles were no longer the tight-knit band of brothers they had once been. The Let It Be sessions revealed just how damaged things had become. Cameras captured the raw tension. Paul would give directions. George would bristle at being told what to do. At one point, George snapped back with words that exposed years of accumulated frustration. He said something like, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." The sarcasm was cutting. The resentment was undeniable. George had grown into a confident songwriter. He had written extraordinary material. Songs like All Things Must Pass and Isn't It a Pity and Run of the Mill were sitting in his notebook, waiting to be recorded. But Paul's controlling approach to the studio left no room for George to breathe. His compositions were often pushed aside. The releases were dominated by Lennon-McCartney songs. George's music remained unheard. On January 10, 1969, George finally reached his breaking point. In the middle of rehearsals for what would become Let It Be, he put down his guitar and walked out. He later said it was very unhealthy and very unhappy for him to stay. It was a shocking moment. John Lennon had threatened to quit before, but George's departure was different. The others realized how essential he was, not just as a guitarist, but as part of the fragile balance that held the entire band together. George returned after 12 days, but the fracture was permanent. The trust had been broken. That same year, George wrote Wah Wah, a song about the headaches that Paul and the Beatles were giving him. The song was brilliant and bitter. It was George converting his pain into art, and it was impossible for anyone who knew the situation to miss what the song was really about. Paul heard it. Paul understood it. But understanding and acting on that understanding are two very different things. In private conversations, Paul admitted to John that George's songs had become as good as theirs, maybe better. But George dismissed this as Paul finally recognizing what should have been obvious all along. He had been writing songs of this quality for years. Paul's recognition felt too late, like consolation for a wound that could have been prevented. The resentment hardened into music. On his landmark solo album All Things Must Pass in 1970, George included Run of the Mill with lyrics directed pointedly at Paul. "You've got me wondering how I lost your friendship." It was a direct accusation. It was George saying, "This was your fault. You did this to us." But then something remarkable happened. In 1969, during the Abbey Road sessions, George Harrison finally got the recognition that had eluded him for years. When the Beatles recorded that album, it was George who delivered two of its standout tracks, Here Comes the Sun and Something. Frank Sinatra would later call Something the greatest love song ever written. John Lennon himself admitted it was the best track on the album. For George, this was vindication. This was proof that his talent had never been the issue. The issue was that Paul had refused to see it. Yet even with this recognition, the damage was done. The Abbey Road sessions were professional, but far from warm. George still resented Paul's interference. Paul still believed George lacked the discipline to refine his ideas. By September 1969, when Abbey Road was released, the Beatles were already unraveling beyond repair. The breakup became official in 1970. George moved forward with extraordinary speed, releasing All Things Must Pass, a triple album that stunned the world with its depth and sophistication. It was an act of creative liberation. Years of bottled-up ideas poured out of him at once. Meanwhile, Paul released McCartney, beginning his solo career and eventually his work with Wings. Both men were proving they could succeed without the Beatles. Both were trying to escape the shadow of what they had been together. Their interactions in the 1970s were sporadic and often cold. In interviews, George openly admitted that he found Paul overpowering. He said something that strung Paul deeply. He said he would happily play in a band with John Lennon again, but not with Paul. The message was clear. One of the two, Paul was the problem, not the music, not the dynamics, Paul. Paul tried to shrug this off publicly, but privately the words cut deep. Here was the younger brother, the boy he had mentored, the person he had championed, saying that working with him had been suffocating. It was a public rejection from someone whose approval Paul had always taken for granted. There were moments of attempted reconciliation. In 1971, George invited Paul to perform at the concert for Bangladesh, but Paul declined, citing logistical concerns. George saw it as another rejection. The absence widened the rift. Years passed. George focused on spirituality and solo projects. Paul pursued relentless commercial success, constantly revisiting the Beatles era, seemingly unable to let go of what they had been. This difference in approach became another point of tension. George felt that Paul was milking the Beatles' past, using their history to sell records, refusing to move forward. Paul felt that George was being ungrateful, that he was criticizing Paul for keeping the music alive. No matter how fractured things appeared, no matter how many cruel words were exchanged, there remained an invisible thread between them, a shared history that neither could escape, even in bitterness. They had created something together that would outlive both of them, and that history, whether they wanted it or not, made them brothers forever. By the early 1990s, time had softened some of the anger. Circumstances brought them back together. On February 11, 1994, George, Paul and Ringo reunited at McCartney's studio to work on unfinished John Lennon demos. The press called them the Threels, and for fans, it felt like a resurrection of something thought lost forever. But beneath the surface excitement, the old dynamics resurfaced. George arrived with firm opinions. He insisted that they needed an outside producer, that without someone to mediate, the egos would clash and the project would fall apart. Paul initially resisted, wanting to control the direction himself, but George was right, and eventually Paul acknowledged it. They brought in Jeff Lynne as producer. Collaboration produced songs like Free as a Bird and Real Love, but even in that process, Paul and George clashed. McCartney wanted the songs to sound quintessentially Beatles, nostalgic and comprehensive. Harrison preferred simplicity and his own melodic instincts. They disagreed on solos, on lyrics, on the very spirit of what the reunion should represent. But this time, they found a way to work through it. This time, there was enough humility on both sides to make compromise possible. Outside the studio, their personal bond remained fragile but deepening. George rarely masked his feelings. He once admitted he still could not imagine being in another band with Paul, that Paul had always been too overpowering, too controlling, too unwilling to share the spotlight. But as the 1990s progressed, Paul began to publicly acknowledge what he had failed to recognize in the 1960s, George's genius as a songwriter. In interviews, Paul admitted he had underestimated his younger bandmate. He called George a late bloomer who ultimately wrote some of the greatest songs ever recorded. It was an acknowledgement, but it came late, very late. As the decade closed, George's health began to falter. A throat cancer diagnosis in 1997, then lung cancer, then a brain tumor. He was physically weakening. He had survived a violent knife attack at his home in Friar Park in 1999, an incident that left him spiritually shaken but somehow more at peace with his life. Paul visited when he could. And despite all their past quarrels, despite the years of silence and resentment, the connection between them deepened as George's time visibly grew short. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison lost his battle with cancer. He was 58 years old. A lifelong smoker whose final years had been marked by increasing physical decline. His ashes were scattered in the sacred waters of the Ganges and Yamuna rivers according to his Hindu beliefs. For Paul McCartney, the loss was devastating, not just the passing of a bandmate, but the death of someone he had known since boyhood, someone he had loved despite all their conflicts. In a 2008 interview, Paul recalled one of their last meetings in a New York hospital. He sat by George's side for hours. They joked about nutty stuff, Paul said, as if they were kids again, as if all the conflict had never happened. At one point, they even held hands, something that would have been unthinkable in their younger years when Liverpool lads did not display affection that way. Paul's voice cracked as he said it. "He was my little baby brother," he said. "The man I once clashed with, the person I once failed to see, had always been family." In the days after George's death, Paul struggled to find words. "He was a lovely man and a very brave man," he said to reporters, his voice strained. "I think he'll be remembered as a great man in his own right." In the years that followed, Paul found ways to keep George close. George had given him a tree, a fir tree that Paul planted near the gate of his home. Every time Paul passes it, he whispers a greeting. "Hi, George." For Paul, the tree is more than a gift. It is George living on, rooted in the earth, still growing, still part of his life. The next generation carried the bond forward. George's son Danny and Paul's daughter Stella became close friends, supporting one another in their careers and their lives. It was as if the younger generation inherited not the rivalry, but the brotherhood that had always lain beneath it. For all the years of conflict and silence, Paul McCartney never stopped seeing George Harrison as family. Their story is one of friendship and rivalry, of ambition and insecurity, of loss and the slow recognition of what mattered all along. It is a story about what happens when two young men create something together that transforms the world, but in doing so, fail to see each other clearly. It is a story about how time can soften anger, but never truly erase it. And it is a story about an unbreakable bond that even death could not erase, though it took death to finally make Paul understand what he should have seen all along, that George Harrison was never the younger brother he needed to mentor. He was always an equal. He always deserved to be treated like one.